Jesus came to a Samaritan city called Sychar. See, Jesus had, prior to this episode, been down in Judea, out in the countryside with his cousin John, the baptizer, the testifier, the voice of the one crying out. It was after his encounter with Nicodemus that Jesus went down there with John to a little town called Aenon near Salim. Aenon literally means natural fountain or spring. An apt description apparently, because the evangelist notes that Jesus was there with John baptizing at Aenon near Salim because water was abundant there. That, of course, all takes place in John chapter 3, prior to our episode today. But water was abundant. Depending on your perspective, of course, abundant water can mean different things. It's kind of subjective, isn't it? Growing up in Melbourne, I spent a lot of time on the beach. I spent a lot of time on my surfboard, sitting in the Atlantic Ocean. Maybe you prefer the Gulf, I don't know. Broad and calm. Or maybe you prefer one of Florida's thousands of lakes. That's some abundant water, right? Or maybe, have you ever been to one of those water parks? You know, the kids section, they have those big old tubs of water. They fill up 10,000 gallons of water and dumps in your head. Kids go screaming all around. Or maybe you've been to one of Father David's baptisms. That's some abundant water, isn't it? But it's all subjective, right? Have you ever traveled to the desert? Or to a place where water is scarce? My friend tells a story of some time spent in Kenya, in a part of that country where you weren't supposed to drink the water before you boiled it, and purified it, and tested it, and did all sorts of other stuff to it. He recalls coming across a bottle of water, just an ordinary half-liter, 16.9-ounce bottle of water. It was still sealed, pure and filtered, clean and ready to drink. And he recalls twisting open that cap and drinking deep. For him, that was an abundance of water. We don't know exactly how much water Jesus and John and the disciples had as they were splashing about in the baptismal waters of Aenon near Salim. But we know their subjective view because the narrator tells us water was abundant. And word got to the Pharisees about Jesus and John baptizing at this little sacramental oasis. So Jesus left Aenon in Judea and he started back to Galilee. And this is where our lesson picks up today, with Jesus deciding to pass through Samaria and arriving at the Samaritan city called Sychar. The narrator notes that Jesus was tired. He had just traveled a distance, some 20 to 30 miles perhaps. So of course he's tired. It says he's tired, so he sits down at the well. This is a bit of great narrative irony that can be found in John's Gospel. Jesus had just come from a place with an abundance of water, and now he's sitting down at a well. Kind of the opposite of that, a place where you have to dig deep in order to lower a bucket to an unknown, unseen stream. So Jesus came to a Samaritan city called Sychar. He was tired and he sat down in a well, and as he was sitting there, a woman approached. And Jesus asked her for a drink. When Jesus asked for this drink, the unnamed woman at the well in Samaria, she was understandably wary. Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. You see, Jews and Samaritans, they had an ancient animosity. Following the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians in 721 BC and the deportation of its inhabitants, there was an influx of foreigners into that region of central Palestine known as Samaria. This is a story, by the way, you can read. It's told in 2 Kings chapter 17. While these newcomers, to some extent, preserved the religion of the previous occupants, the remaining Jews regarded their beliefs and practices as polluted by pagan and therefore illegitimate practices. A particular source of aggravation was the setting up on Mount Gerizim of an alternate rival place of worship to the temple in Jerusalem. This and other factors led to hostility and social separation, which is summed up in the woman's response to Jesus. How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? And thus the narrator's explanation: Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. You ever heard of Sister Helen Prejean? She was a Catholic nun, a member of the Congregation of St. Joseph, who wrote the book Dead Man Walking. The story of her experience as a spiritual advisor to a man on death row. You know, we might assume that Sister Helen ended up in this position because, well, she's a nun, right? And that's what nuns do. They serve the people no one else will. But Sister Helen's story is much more complicated. She grew up in a warm, loving Catholic family and decided at an early age she would become a nun. When she joined an order, she was determined to be the most pious, the most obedient, the most prayerful nun, seeking perfection. That is, until the church and the world around her began to change. It was the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement. Many nuns from the U.S., they went to Latin America, they went to poor inner cities to work with those who were living in poverty. Sister Helen decided that a cloistered life of prayer wasn't her calling after all. She developed a passion for working with the poor and moved into a housing project in New Orleans. She began to engage people who lived there, to really get to know them. And from these people whose backgrounds and lives were so different from hers, she learned about what she describes as the other America, where people navigate the world without connections that offer a layer of protection from consequences, where people don't trust the police and where the police don't trust the people. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't so virtuous after all. She was just protected and cushioned. One day she walked out of an adult learning center in her neighborhood, and a man called out to her, "Hey, Sister Helen!" He carried a clipboard and was approaching everyone on the street. "You want to be a pen pal to someone on death row?" he asked. She didn't know much about the death penalty, but she knew if someone was on death row, that person was in poverty. She was called to serve the poor. So how hard can it be to write a letter? I mean, she'd been an English major after all. She describes this as her first encounter with sneaky Jesus. The Jesus who sneaks up on you and draws you into something that seems harmless enough. I'm only writing a few letters, she thought. But then she got a letter in return from her pen pal, a man named Pat, saying he never had any visitors. So she went to visit. And then Pat asked her to be his spiritual advisor. And she said yes, not knowing that when he was put to death, the only person who could be with him all the way to the end was his spiritual advisor. Sneaky Jesus meets us where we are and draws us to the places we never thought we'd go. That day on the street, signing her name to that clipboard, Sister Helen could not have foreseen that she would be the face of love that Pat saw as he was put to death, or that his life and death would ignite in her a calling to speak for the love and forgiveness of all God's children. When Jesus and this unnamed woman meet at a well in Samaria, they are wary of one another. Understandably, Jesus has walked a long way on a hot, dry day, and being human, he is tired and thirsty. This woman is by herself with a jar at a well, and she is naturally suspicious of the man who asks her for a drink. She is especially suspicious because she can tell he's Jewish. Remember, Jews and Samaritans were deeply mistrustful of one another, even though to us, the differences between them seem trivial. A disagreement over where they should worship God. But as we all know too well, even or often, the trivial differences create the major boundaries. Mistrust between people. Fortunately for us, Jesus fails to follow the culturally acceptable script. Instead of refusing to interact with the woman simply because she is a Samaritan and a woman, he engages her. He speaks to her, he listens to her, he sees her beyond her labels. All of which allows her to see beyond that Jesus is Jewish and a man. As they talk, she discovers that this tired and thirsty Jew is not just hanging out by a well waiting for someone to give him water. He knows things. He speaks in metaphors. He offers her water, but not the usual kind. He speaks about God in ways she has never heard before. Most remarkably, he is unafraid to talk with her. Utterly unashamed by their encounter, he welcomes the opportunity to engage her, to converse with her, in spite of the things that should divide them from each other. And in the end, their conversation is the longest recorded conversation between Jesus and any other person in the New Testament. The woman leaves transformed, inspired to share the good news of this unlikely encounter with her community. The news that there is more to God than worshiping God in the right spot. The news that God might just be bigger than they thought, big enough, in fact, to hold together Jew and Samaritan, and Gentile and Roman, and Presbyterian and Methodist, and Baptist and Catholic and Episcopalian, maybe even Muslim and Buddhist, black and white, immigrant and laborer, and even Democrat and Republican. God can hold us together. And if we are willing to engage one another beyond all that divides us, we will be transformed. Oh, and notice as well something that seems like a minor passing phrase. Notice the time. The narrator tells us it was about noon. Now, maybe the narrator is just trying to tell us that the noon sun is shining at full volume, something we know full well from our experience of Florida summers. Maybe the narrator is simply trying to tell us that the temperature is at its zenith, and that shadows and shade are scarce. There are few places to hide from the blazing sun. It was about noon. We don't know for sure that that time of day had a tremendous effect on the realization of thirst. But we do know for sure that it had something to do with quenching it. You see, just a few chapters later in the Gospel of John, Jesus will be betrayed, arrested, and denied. Jesus will be beaten, mocked, and struck repeatedly. Jesus will be hurting. He's with Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate talking to Jesus and to the assembled crowd. The crowd had a hunger on that day, didn't they? They seemed to be extra hungry for something on that day, because when Pilate told them he found no case against Jesus, the crowd got angry and cried out, "Crucify him! Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" And so they led Jesus out on a death march, carrying his execution on his back, feeling the effects of that abundant thirst. And the text says it was about noon. This is the only other time in the Bible that this exact phrase is used. It was about noon when all this took place. I just have to think that there is some sort of connection there. The same time that that woman of Samaria, that woman at the well, realized her abundant thirst is the same time that Jesus was killed because he loved too abundantly. The same time she realized her need was the same time Jesus met it. Well, maybe that's a sermon for Good Friday. The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, so that I may never be thirsty." So he did. Jesus did. Unto his own end. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.